All right, you guys, happy Friday. I promise you a short video. So the two things we have left to talk about are adolescence and parenting. So I did mention that I wanted to talk about James Marcia's theory. So remember, Erickson said that the stage of adolescence, your only job is to answer the question, who am I, to figure yourself out. So James Marcia is the researcher that goes into more depth on just identity as an adolescent. So he says that there are kind of like 4 different things you can go through on the path to figuring out who you are. The first one is identity foreclosure, and that happens when somebody commits to values or roles that others sort of prescribe. What that means is you haven't really done the work of figuring out who you are, but you just sort of accept the fact that you're the good student, or you're the good athlete, or you're the religious person, or whatever it might be. So you sort of just accept things, accept the ways that other people see you, but you haven't really done the work of figuring out if those things are who you are, or if that's all that you are. So an example would be like when I used to teach in Monroe. I had a student, and she was an amazing athlete. She went to play D1 basketball. So she was awesome. And I remember saying in class, hey, who are you? Answer the question, who am I? And she was like, I'm an athlete. I'm like, that's awesome. I was like, what else? What else makes you up? She's like, I like to work out. And I was like, uh-huh. And I said, what else? And she said, I'm healthy. And I was like, yep. And then she's like, Dom, I don't know what you're asking me. And I said, oh, well, what I'm asking you is, who are you beyond being an athlete? Because at some point in your life, being an athlete is going to end, right? Right now, the entire town sees you and they're like, oh my God, how many rebounds did you have? All these questions that they ask you. So you are literally defined by being an athlete. And you've just accepted that. That's just who you are, and you don't really think beyond that. But at some point, that's gone. At some point, you're not living in a community where they see you and know exactly everything about you according to this one label. So that's identity foreclosure. You just accept something and you hold on to it without really thinking or doing the work. The next one is identity moratorium. That happens when you delay committing to an identity, which just means you hold off on forming your opinions on things. You hold off on saying exactly who you are, but instead you're in the process of figuring things out. So maybe if you go off to college, you're going to attend lots of different group meetings and things like that to figure out what you're into, and you might even, I don't know, start to question different parts of who you are. So an example of that might be that when I went off to college, I don't know, we were sitting around one day and people were talking about religion, and they're like, oh, what religion are you? And I was like, Lutheran. And they're like, oh, what do you like about being Lutheran? And I was like, nothing. And they're like, well, why are you Lutheran then? And I was like, oh, I don't know. I was raised Lutheran. I went to Lutheran private school, things like that. And we really got talking, and I thought to myself, wow, I'm not religious or spiritual at all. And I just said, oh, I'm Lutheran. That's very identity foreclosure, right? So then I went through this whole process, and it took me years. I mean, I'm talking, it wasn't until relatively recently that I really figured out my religious identity. And so I started to learn lots of different things. I went to lots of different groups. I kind of took things from a variety of different religions and things like that to formulate kind of my belief system. So that means for a very long time, religiously, I was in identity moratorium. I didn't want to commit to anything because I was trying out lots of stuff. The next one is identity diffusion. So that occurs when a person lacks a clear sense of identity, but still hasn't explored any issues. So you're not really sure who you are, but you haven't really done the work. So I could use my religious example for that as well, right? I wasn't really sure who I was religiously when students asked me that, or when my friends asked me that, but I wasn't doing anything to develop my opinion on that. So think about how many times we do that related to who we are or where we stand on issues. The next one then is identity achievement, and that occurs when you've considered lots of possibilities and you commit to an identity, okay? And again, you guys, this isn't suggesting that you're going through life oh my God, I have no idea who I am. But the question is, who will you be apart from your parents or guardians, right? Are you the religion that you are for the rest of your life, and that's because of your parents or guardians? What about political affiliation? What about your stance on social issues? What about your belief system as it relates to I don't know, anything in society, all right? So all of those things that you have to do the work of figuring out. And if you do the work, and in the end you decide on what your identity is, then you would reach identity achievement. If you don't do the work, then you're in foreclosure or possibly diffusion, okay? So So that's really the main thing to talk about with adolescence, mostly because you guys are aware of like all the puberty-related issues and things like that that come up. Obviously, your book talks a lot about gender and things like that as well, but this is the one that I needed to highlight that isn't really covered heavily in the book. The last thing then is parenting styles, and again, I know that your book talks about them. You do have to identify Diana Baumrind as the parenting researcher. She basically said that there are 4 different types of parents: authoritarian, authoritative, permissive, and uninvolved. So just looking at this chart, and you guys should take some time to read through it. An authoritative parent is one that feels kind of warm and attentive. They have demands. So there are rules, there are expectations, but those rules and expectations sort of coincide with your maturity level or your age. So kind of the older you get and the more mature you get, the more that you have a say in things, the more that you can talk through rules, things like that. So when it gets to autonomy, you're not just making all of your own decisions, but your parents aren't responding like, because I said so, okay? The older you get, they're going to talk with you about why your curfew is what your curfew is, and they're going to listen to your point of view when you're trying to argue for a different curfew or something like that. It doesn't mean you're going to get your way, to be clear, but it means that they're willing and open to having a conversation, but that they also have expectations. The authoritarian parent comes off as kind of cold and rejecting. They might be degrading. In this type of parenting style, there are a lot of rules. There are very high demands. They might yell. They might command, meaning you do this. There is no questioning. They might criticize, and they usually rely heavily on punishment, even if that punishment kind of falls under that almost emotionally abusive banner. Finally, in terms of autonomy, the parent is really making all of the decisions regardless of your age, and they're rarely listening to what you want. So this is the household that is super, super heavy in rules, and you really have no say, so there's no point in even having a conversation with them. The next one is permissive. If you can think of the mom in Mean Girls, if you've seen that movie, that's the permissive style, okay? It's where the parent is like warm and they definitely have a relationship with their child, but the child's almost like spoiled. So they might make few demands or no demands. Like there might be some rules, but also like, are they really rules, right? That whole like, I'm not a real mom, I'm a cool mom from that movie. So usually what happens here is because it's like this very friendly, rule-lacking type of environment, what's happening is that children are allowed to make their own decisions at a younger age than they're actually ready for, okay? So they might be making like bad decisions because their parent is so permissive. Their parent allows them to do all of these things. The last one is uninvolved, and it's exactly that. It's where the parent is pretty detached. They virtually have no real like relationship or connection with their child. There are few demands because they're not even really paying attention to them. They have no interest in them. There are no expectations. And in terms of autonomy, the parent doesn't really care because the kid is just sort of like making whatever decisions they want anyway. To be honest, the uninvolved one is sort of like you're raising yourself a little bit. Sometimes we look at our friends' parents and we're like, oh, that's so cool. I wish my parents let me do whatever I want. But I really want you guys to think about the impact of parenting on who you are and on your overall development. Okay. Also think about what type of parent would you want to be? What do you think are the positives and negatives to each one of these? So that's really it. We've covered all of the other stuff. If there are things that you were absent for, I would just encourage you to go on YouTube and try to find videos on those specific researchers. Have a good weekend.